You can see your presentation.
Fantastic. Well, look, advisor with the Corum group here in Singapore, but back in 2013, running my Australian software business Locatrix for a few years, and I do note, Alan, you reminded me 2013 was Bangkok, and it's now 2022, and we're still doing location-based services that we had built for carriers like Telstra and Virgin Mobile in the world. But I've had kind of a change of career since then, and I'll mention briefly that I sold Locatrix in 2018. For the last nearly 4 years, I've been up in Singapore, most of which is I spent with me wearing a tie. Alan knows I'm more comfortable being a t-shirt guy to developer conference. But in addition to selling Locatrix, which I did, I also had spun off a company from the University of Queensland back in, I guess we kicked that off in about 2001, 2002. To doing the entrepreneurial thing, I was working both here and also back in Australia for Red Hat, but also Compaq, and through that acquisition of Tandem Computers. And Tandem was kind of where I got my telecoms job today, or historically for its financial institution work, does and did actually do a lot of work in the sort of contributed to both TADSummit and TADHack around the place. So again, congratulations to Alan. And for everyone who's many times that TADSummit was the best single technology conference I ever went to. So, excuse me. So we primarily work sell side and only with software and technology companies. And that's quite unique. We're not trying to get deals all over the place. We really focus on software and technology, a niche in the overall M&A market. But two, it's one where we're able to contribute an awful lot of value, both through our education day, but also the fact that we spend a lot of time teaching entrepreneurial Series A funding or all sorts of folks will give you advice. But when it comes to actually how you would exit or realize some sort of value from the company, there's not a lot out there. This is one of the ways in which I'm really pleased that Corum does spend a lot of time talking to entrepreneurs and through a bunch of courses, financial associates and things like that who do work on deals. But the 20 very proud about is we probably sold more software-related firms than anyone. That's not an idle boast, that's a fact. So pretty interesting firm, and it's a pretty broad church. I'll do a bit of a breakdown of the types of companies, because it is very diverse, both in terms of the types of companies that are in the communication sector, some different ways in which valuations in the valuation sector, both sort of current year to date and the last few years, how that's trending. We'll also talk about transaction time. But I do want to encourage you, I'll make sure Alan has the slides. A lot of people, particularly, just say the magic word, TADSummit. So in terms of where we're seeing the community, take it with a grain of salt, there's a number of transactions which were actually published, which were advertised, which were press released, however it was, not all values attached, but the number of deals we've seen in the attributable to the communication sector. And interesting about the volume of deals in M&A is it's still pretty heavily leveraged towards strategics. And by strategics, I mean, think of the brand name companies. It's the Googles, it's the Facebooks, it's the IBMs, it's the, it's the big companies who are acquiring another company with strategic value. But we are seeing some activity, particularly in the private equity side. And I know there's probably a lot of relatively small-sized technology entrepreneurs in the room who are thinking, well, private equity is something which never has entered your radar. One of the most surprising things, if you look at M&A today, particularly as it pertains to software and technology, is how active the private equity firms are, and can be in a certain sector of private equity firms, in doing deals which are, not just obviously acquiring bigger platform companies that they want to try and grow, but also then acquiring what we call bolt-ons, smaller companies that either fit a particular product, complementary product or sector, or potentially a market or a region that can really add value to that platform. And what's interesting is if you look at all the private equity deals that we see across all of software technology each year, there's no bolt-on transactions to each one platform deal. So it really does become an interesting option for entrepreneurs of companies of a certain size that want to be able to look for a way to sort of realise the value that we include in communications technology. I generally talk about sort of the main sort of UCaaS, CPaaS, potentially that's a bucket where you see a lot of the value-added things like AI and chat and things like that, communications. capabilities on top of a basic network. So this is January 1 through September 30. There's been 122 characteristics of communications technology. There's still a lot of activity in the strategic acquisition space. Now, if you look at industry-wide, what you tend to see is nearly $100 billion. It's much less this year, not because there hasn't been as much activity. We've just had less of those mega deals. I think the number, while it's substantially less than 1.7.7, it's not dramatically less in actions. And this is really representative of the number of opportunities there are for entrepreneurs, CEOs who've built up some good, interesting technology and hopefully revenue-making, hopefully profit-making companies to actually look for decent acquisition options. Excuse me. Now, one of the things that I find a little bit interesting about the communications sector is just at the moment, from an activity standpoint. So again, these are deals that have been announced in the market. It's still very US-centric. I know you're sitting there in Europe. There's a lot of folks in Europe. And what is perplexing to me is the amount of innovation I'm seeing in Asia, and the fact that historically, we haven't seen a large percentage of, and that's the sellers, so this is a geographic thing of sellers, but if you look at the buyers, the actual buyers are even more USA-centric. Just starting to tell me, hey, we're starting to look beyond the UK and the US. So we're starting to look towards that rest of the world. In that rest of the world bucket, that absolutely includes me. Anyone who's not sort of UK-centric or North American, where a lot of the growth will come in 2023 and beyond. Now, I mentioned before the private equity firm, a relatively small sample frame in terms of only 122. It is always dominated by the private equity firms, usually by a ratio of 3 or more to 1. So this means that there's more deals happening, potentially a private equity firm backed small strategic company. If you can look for some of the trends and rationales for buyers acquiring company, actually able to start looking at, well, we'd be a really good bolt-on for that. And this is one of the things that Corum's particularly focused on, because it's an area that most target markets for their software or for their product. You can sell your product, sell your service, but when it comes to buyers, how do you identify the folks that would be actually big acquirers? You tend to gravitate your thoughts towards the strategics. And one of the things that's really useful to understand is just the role that the private equity firms play. In particular, we've had a bit to do lately with Grain and Stonepeak. And they're particularly, not directly acquisitive outside of North America just yet, but starting to get that appetite. And looking at the communications sector in particular as something that they want to be able to spend more time with, start increasingly have greater appetite for. So, I guess the take home from that is if you're a software or technology CEO in the communications space and you're thinking that you'd ultimately like to realise your investment. And there's many reasons, and again, I won't go into all the details of different ways in which rationales for selling a company. But, there are many, many reasons you would go to market. But if you want to be able to look at, trying to sort of calibrate power in the market, it's a pretty good time sort of now. The Striker acquisition was actually, the Striker acquisition of Aveiro was actually relatively small, about $3 million. What's interesting about that one is, as a communications provider and collaboration provider, was a really strong valuation publishing. If anyone wants to get that, please reach out and drop me a note. I'll certainly get a link to it and tweet it out so that the TADSummit folks can get it. But there's sometimes we're seeing that if you look at the ranges of valuations, we always talk about multiples of either EBITDA or a revenue. They tend to skew higher, clearly, as bigger company value. And these innovative areas on top of communications. We're adding some AI, machine learning, because this is the space as a sort of service provider in the unified communications. It's all exclusively kind of North American and Western Europe. But what's interesting about this deal was a relatively decent sized deal for a provider that wasn't really a great valuation. So we're sort of tracking some of these. Again, it's hard to look at any single transaction and point at that and say, well, exactly like that. you've got to be able to look at a range of transactions to be able to understand sort of where you'll sit from a valuation standpoint. And this is another one. Again, what's kind of interesting about this is, outside of that North America and UK bubble, we see most of the sellers and buyers coming from the same place, which suggests to me that there's not a lot of appetite just yet for sellers to actually start to think about, well, who else would I sell to? And one of the things I can absolutely encourage, a lot of the entrepreneurs in the room is, if you're thinking about you'll ever want to sell, there will be huge benefits in looking well and truly beyond your national borders or your regional borders when it comes to finding acquirers, because, again, the expansion appetite for a lot of the private equity-backed smaller strategics to move into different markets is only growing. And, so this is just an interesting example to look at, but, just from a telltale. And look, we've tried to, it's a pretty start to move more in 2023 and beyond. You'll see a lot more deals, and you will provide better customer experiences. And communication services, in all their various forms and capabilities, does community experience. And I think going forward, that's probably where we're going to see the greatest innovation, and ultimately a ton of again, sitting out here in Singapore and working primarily in the Asia Pacific region, clearly the largest hubs for the communications M&A. But I think Asia and parts of Europe really are underexploited. Anecdotally, I can talk about a number of the different firms that we've been talking about. Contact solutions all remain strong. But there is going to be, there is obviously a large appetite for consolidation. And again, this is the opportunity of this. It's all, here's the thing, it's all free. I'm not going to try and sell you anything. But if you look at the corumgroup.com events, there's a number of education-based, really, and we do them right around the world. Currently they're online, although that was a post-pandemic thing. We're starting to do more and more as well, which are really worthwhile. And I do mention there is a regular one coming up now around communication, but it's always good as a CEO to understand where you're headed. And look, in conclusion, and Alan, I hope I'm ahead of schedule. I think I'm pretty close to it. Building out better products and be the guy that is trying to one up, if that makes any sense.
Cool. Thanks, Mark.